You've got a great idea for a small business, but you just can't get it off the ground. You want to be your own boss, set your own hours. Well, new year means new opportunities, and Shopify's got you covered to help get your venture off the ground. Shopify makes it easy to manage your growing business. You can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. And they help with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard. Don't kick yourself next holiday season when your 2025 resolution list looks the same as it does today. Make it happen with Shopify. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. So for this special episode of the Seat at the Table series, I have to ask a question. Is there a doctor in the house? Yes, there actually is. I am joined today by a special guest, Max from the Poor Historians Podcast. Max, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, great to be here.
So Max had reached out a while back to invite me to be on their podcast, and so I wanted to return the favor, and especially with this individual. So we are going to be talking about William H. Crawford, who, if anybody knows anything about Crawford, it's the election of 1824 and the medical emergency that may have shifted the course of American history and determined a president. But before we get to that, I want to give Max a chance to talk about his podcast, which, again, thank you so much for having me on. That was a great conversation for listeners of Presidencies. If you haven't checked it out yet, we had a great conversation about Grover Cleveland and his secret yacht surgery. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please be sure to do so. I'll try and share it around the release of this episode. But Max, please tell us more about the Poor Historians Podcast for any of our listeners who didn't check out that episode and put you on their regular rotation.
Hey, I appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, I'm Max, and I Dr. Max or Max is both fine. We're very casual over on the Poor Historians Podcast, but I am a emergency physician who is I'm an emergency physician who, along with my two practicing partners in emergency medicine, started a podcast about medical history several years ago. And we've been going about 3 years strong now by the time you're listening to this. And we try to break down medical history stories from an expertise in medicine, but as an amateur historian. So we do so with a friend of ours named Elba, who has a professional comedian's background. And we try to make medicine a little bit more accessible for everyone by going through some of the stories in the history of our profession, which have a ludicrousness to them that can only be appreciated, I think, through a modern lens. And we see what we can do to at least make tough subjects a little bit lighter. And I hope that's what we did.
Absolutely. It was so fascinating to be on, and knowing the Cleveland story from the historical point of view, but being able to have that medical knowledge and expertise really helped to enlighten me on just how wild that whole scenario was. So
not a lot of surgeries are recommended to be done on a rolling ship when the guy's tied to a mast in secrecy, underway at that. So it was a really cool story. And like a lot of the stories in medical history, and probably also in the history of the presidencies, you start out thinking you kind of know what's going on, and then as you dive into it, it gets more and more interesting.
Well, and speaking of, I can say, having researched Crawford's history, there is a lot to discuss, and there are definitely some twists and turns along the way that folks may not be aware of. But hopefully after this episode, and of course, because he is one of those figures in American history that has such a lengthy story, this is actually going to be a two-part episode. So this is part one. We'll start talking about his early life and get him into the cabinet in this episode. So I say let's go ahead and dive in and start the life of William H. Crawford.
Sounds good.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
So William Harris Crawford, when he came into the world on February 24th, 1772 in Amherst County, Virginia, was the sixth child born to Joel and Fanny Harris Crawford. So William's great-grandfather, John, the Earl of Crawford, had been born in Scotland in 1600 and had immigrated to the British colony of Virginia in 1643. So at least on his father's side, it seems like the family had been here for a few generations. And as noted by Crawford's biographer, Chase C. Mooney, quote, as a family, the Crawfords had been described as clannish, large of stature, physically powerful, given to a considerable amount of intermarriage, and not without some distinction.
I like the stature noted there.
Yes. And we'll see as we go along, I've got a couple of descriptions of him along the way, and it seems like William Crawford did fit into that family stature. So despite or possibly due to the large family, which would ultimately grow to 11 children, which, wow, 11 children, Joel suffered some financial setbacks, and to seek new opportunities, he moved his family to the Edgefield district of South Carolina in 1779. Now, the family's new home was located around 30 miles from Augusta, Georgia, which at this point was occupied by the British, as this was during the Revolutionary War. Joel was actually on the Patriot side of the war, and at one point was captured and imprisoned at Camden, though some of his loyalist neighbors arranged for his release.
It's complicated interplay there.
Yeah. And it's interesting, to explore these, and especially like when you go down into the southern region during the war, there was some strong loyalist camps there, and so much of it was occupied for some time. So it was interesting that they chose to move there and that he ended up captured, but thankfully, apparently he made a good enough impression on his neighbors that they tried to help him out.
Well, I was going to say, my general rule is I try to make friends with every one of my neighbors in real life because I never know when I'm going to be imprisoned as a political prisoner. It's best to keep your options open.
Absolutely. It sounds like he was following under that train of thought. So always good to have neighbors on your side.
Agree.
So with the conclusion of the war in 1783, Joel Crawford moved his family across the border into Georgia on a site near modern-day Appling. As other Virginia families were settling in the area, it seems like it was a good place for the Crawfords. Now, though we don't know any details, it does seem like young William got some schooling in his younger years and at one point attended a school in Augusta. However, in 1788, the family's finances were such that William had to leave his studies at the academy and instead assume a teaching position there to earn some extra money.
He had a side gig.
Yeah, just go from the student's desk to the teacher's.
Fair enough. Always be hustling.
Always be hustling. Now, sadly, Joel Crawford passed away that same year, and William spent the next few years alternating between teaching and helping out on the family farm. So, kind of a rough start for him. But in 1794, the 22-year-old William Crawford was able to enroll in Carmel Academy, which was a college preparatory school near Appling, Georgia. While we don't know if William had in his mind to fulfill his father's desire for him to attend the University of Edinburgh, or if he had another college in mind that he wanted to prepare for, he spent 2 years at the academy, becoming usher, which was a position that acted as kind of an assistant or under teacher. And in his second year, he gained the respect of the headmaster of the school. So it seems like he's starting to really embrace that education, doing well thus far, getting some of that expertise behind him.
I would say it's a generally good way to go about things as well.
Oh, yeah. You want to get on the good side of the teachers. So in July 1796, Crawford got an offer to serve as the first English teacher at Richmond Academy in Augusta for $300 a year, which was an offer that Crawford accepted. And he became close to the rector who hired him. And after this rector resigned at the end of 1797, Crawford took his place, with his salary increasing to $500 to reflect his additional responsibilities. So
good money.
He's moving up pretty quick. Yeah.
It's probably like, I don't know, $48,000 in today's money. I'm purely speculating. I have no idea.
that math sounds about right. So the first evidence of Crawford's involvement with public affairs is a letter from the quote-unquote Young Men of Augusta of July 2nd, 1798, which Crawford signed and which was sent to President John Adams, quote, assuring him of their unalterable attachment to our country and its government. So later political opponents would bring up this letter to attack Crawford for, quote, having approved the oppressive measures of the Adams administration, though this was clearly not the case, as word of the 2 of the 4 Alien and Sedition Acts passed by that point had not reached Augusta, and the remaining 2 Alien and Sedition Acts wouldn't be passed until after the letter was sent. So at this point, they were just saying, hey, we support the government because, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it was during the Quasi-War. We had a great deal of conflict with France at the time. This was after the XYZ affair. And so it seemed like war was coming up. And so it makes sense for young men to say, hey, we support our government.
I'm also struck by the fact that his political opponents were trying to use a letter that this is sort of like college or pre-college, right? And so imagine that. Imagine if this was the era that we live in now, where every posting you've ever made on the internet can be used against you. Imagine the power that everybody's opponents would have. This is terrifying.
Exactly.
I can only imagine the stuff I wrote back at that time, I also don't hold any political office, probably for that reason.
Yeah, and it's something that we see even in the present day. You hear opponents attacking one another because, oh, well, you did this thing 40 years ago. And it's like, well, they were a kid. They were, they were a teenager in their early 20s. Yeah, don't go digging up that stuff.
No, be careful what you post to Instagram, people.
Exactly. If you do, find somebody who can go ahead and wipe that slate clean.
Indeed.
But yeah, so Crawford, this is something back in those days, and he was attacked for, but it certainly doesn't seem like he was in support of the Alien Sedition Acts. He didn't know that they were even a thing, and 2 of them weren't a thing at that point. So Crawford also got involved in a petition to Governor George Matthews, urging him to not sign the Yazoo Land Bill, which many saw as a public corruption to the benefit of a few land speculators. And again, not going down that. We actually talked about that in the Jefferson narrative series, but basically it was just a large tract of land that these speculators were wanting to earn a lot of money off of. And it just went back and forth it was about 2 decades before it was finally settled.
I can appreciate it. I've spent at least multiple hours of my life watching videos on YouTube about the Yazoo Land Bill. So I have been down that rabbit hole so many times. We all have.
We all have, just admit it. It's one of the sexiest parts of American history, the Yazoo Land Bill.
It's got a Y and a Z in it. It absolutely is true.
But though Matthews would ultimately sign the bill, this experience brought Crawford into the acquaintance of future political allies, including Senator James Jackson of Savannah, whose leadership of the opposition to the Yazoo Land Bill would position him to be the leader of the state's Democratic-Republican faction. So, making some good contacts thus far if he's wanting to get into politics.
Networking. It's always networking, isn't it?
Exactly. It's always about the networking. So, in addition to serving as the rector and a teacher at Richmond Academy, in 1798, Crawford found time to study law, and at the beginning of 1799, he left his post at the Academy and Augusta to start a new career. So, in the spring of 1799, Crawford opened up a law office in Lexington, Georgia, And this would become his base of operations for his rise in the state political schema. So it's interesting, of course, when you're talking about politics at this point in American history, there are lots of lawyers.
That did change, though, right? We don't have very many anymore in politics.
Not as many. We've still got some, but not as many. But it's interesting at this point, they didn't have many law schools. Most folks would train by kind of being apprentice to another lawyer. They would study under another lawyer, but I haven't mentioned that here.
Interesting. And medicine was very similar in this time. You had medical schools well established over in Europe and a few in the United States, but curriculum was all over the place. You could start a medical school on a whim, and most physicians really, maybe they went to a year or two, if that, but it was an apprenticeship. And especially with surgeons of the time, whether it was here in the U.S. or overseas, a lot of that was done through apprenticeship. You would, and you could ascend to the ranks quite a bit. The formal education obviously helped that, but there is a parallel there, no doubt.
Yeah. And it's just interesting. It's like, and I didn't find anything. I'm assuming that or at least I'm hoping that he studied some law books, law manuals before actually opening up his law office. But hey, who knows?
Hey, if you put them on the shelf behind him, they looked really nice. They were leather bound. You trust them. You just trust them.
Exactly. And here we get our first physical description of Crawford. So Crawford was described at this time as a, quote, ruggedly handsome giant of a man.
Nice.
6'3" and well over 200 pounds, with regular features, clear, blue, mild, though radiant eyes, and a fair and ruddy complexion. He was very active physically, but somewhat awkward in movement, possessed little vanity, and not many of the social graces, had a fine logical mind and a good command of the English language, but his oratorical skills were not proportionate to his powerful voice. Believing so thoroughly in getting to the heart of the matter quickly and possessing a greater desire to convince than to please, Crawford was sometimes considered blunt.
I like one thing that is an interesting parallel in medicine of the time, too, is that when you read cases from back in these times, the physical description of a patient was similarly eloquent. And, this is a time when you didn't have pictures of people everywhere. You didn't have, so many images that you could rely on. You had to verbally describe things. But it was very common that the physicians of the time would describe somebody with favorable health in the description or in the chart itself. So if somebody was, tall with, what was it? Ruggedly handsome giant of a man, that was another way of almost saying as a physician, they had really good health. And when people had a lot of health maladies, you would see the description change quite a bit to not just say, okay, they had XYZ symptom, but it would be like they had a, faint appearance, or they had a sickly appearance, or a waning constitution. There was a lot of ways to describe it. It was just sort of one way I like to think about it is just a lot more fun to read medical charts from back in this time, because they are much more narrative and just descriptive. It's just, they're more interesting than the dry medicine of today, which is honestly more precise, but just lacks a little bit of charm in my view.
You like to read about these giant of a man descriptions.
Correct. Much more interesting.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and that's really fascinating. And it, we've touched on medicine with some of the other episodes, and, we've gotten into it's so fascinating that some of the medicine, the way they would do things, it would turn out to be right, but not because of the reasons that they thought of. Mm-hmm. But then you have Benjamin Rush's thunderclap pills and all these other things that, it's always interesting to hear what medicine was like back then.
Yeah, yet to do a deep dive on Benjamin Rush, but I have a picture of him in my head from what I do know of kind of a, would be like a Keystone Cop physician of the time, kind of sometimes got it right, sometimes very wrong, and just was bumbling the whole time. But yes, sometimes we do fail correctly back in these times in medicine.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, and again, not going to go down the rabbit hole, but the political elements of medicine, and especially when you're talking about the yellow fever epidemics, the fact that you had Democratic Republican doctors versus Federalist doctors, it just really fascinating.
Yep. That carries overseas as well into other countries' histories we've definitely come across.
Oh, wow. Wow. But that's for another time. So we've got our giant of a man with his regular features. So Crawford got his first government job at the end of the year in 1799 when the state legislature authorized and Governor James Jackson appointed him as a member of a commission, quote, to prepare a 1-volume digest of the Georgia laws. So for this project, Crawford worked with the Georgia Secretary of State, Horatio Marbury, on this project. And on March 2nd, 1801, they sent the finished project to Governor Jackson, who had it printed the following year. So that's a good way if you're new to the law game. Yeah, just go ahead and put together a digest of the laws. Good way to study them.
Make another one of those big books you put behind you. I get it.
Exactly. So spending a good portion of over a year in the state capitol, which was then located in Louisville, Georgia, allowed Crawford an opportunity, quote, to become better acquainted with the details of the laws of the state and facilitated contacts that seemed not to have injured his law practice or hampered his political career. So, yeah, you're making the contacts, you're getting known as kind of an expert in state law. That's going to help.
He's spending time on LinkedIn and social media. He's doing his thing.
Exactly. So indeed, his law practice would get a boost when one of his new associates was elected to Congress and turned his clients over to Crawford, thus making him, quote, perhaps the most active lawyer in the Western Circuit. This, however, aroused jealousy in another up-and-coming lawyer/politico, John Clark, who was rising to become, quote, the leader of the Republican group of speculators, small farmers, and transplanted North Carolinians in Georgia. In 1802, this rivalry would end up leading to a challenge in an affair of honor by one of Clark's lieutenants, Peter Lawrence Van Allen. And when Van Allen and Crawford dueled at Fort Charlotte across the border in South Carolina, in the second round, Crawford shot and fatally wounded Van Allen.
Clear winner. Clear winner on that one, I guess.
Clear winner. But, this was a time duels were quite popular. And Crawford apparently was into the dueling because in December 1803, he nearly ended up in a duel with Clark himself after accusing him of unduly influencing grand juries to make recommendations for Clark's favorite candidate for a judgeship, but a court of honor was ultimately convened before they could meet on the dueling ground, and the matter was settled peacefully.
No, but that's not as dramatic. Now, it's interesting because dueling was such a part of society. Believe it or not, one of our earliest episodes talked about famous physicians either involved in duels or at duels. And certainly we learned a lot about how pervasive this method of settling disputes was. It's interesting. I'm not saying the modern American public wouldn't be opposed to it, just the way that things have gone some days, but it is, I am glad personally that we've moved beyond. Mostly.
Yes. Mostly.
We still duel on social media.
Yeah. But Crawford wasn't just spending his time getting into duels. In 1803, he was elected to the state legislature, and the next year he would start a family. Susanna Girardin, born in 1780 and thus 7 or 8 years younger than Crawford, we don't know her exact birth date, just the year, was the daughter of Louis Girardin, a planter of French Huguenot descent from the Savannah River Valley. It's not known how the two met, but in 1804 they were married, and in March the next year their first child, a daughter named Caroline, was born. Between 1805 and 1821, Susanna gave birth to 3 daughters and 5 sons, though I could only confirm that 2 of the daughters and 3 of the sons lived to adulthood.
Common for the time, certainly.
Yes. As a father, Mooney noted that, quote, every child, from the oldest to the youngest, was free to express his or her opinion on the topic of the moment. If any opinion or assertion was combated, it was in such a way as to demonstrate how a more correct judgment might be reached. The father was subject to the same treatment as all the others and is said to have admitted his errors or argued his defense in the same kind spirit and good temper as everyone else.
I like that. So there was no, I told you so, or because I said so in that household. Everything was litigated.
Exactly.
I can respect that.
You would expect from a lawyer. He sent his children, quote, to the best schools, and Crawford personally examined the children daily to satisfy himself about their progress and the methods of instruction. He would often have them read with him. So sounds like he was very involved. So in the same year that they were wed, Crawford acquired 260 acres that would form the basis of his plantation Woodlawn, 3 miles from Lexington. Around this time, Crawford enslaved 2 to 4 individuals, but that number would grow to 16 by 1811. So we do know that he did enslave individuals, and so we'll come back to that.
Run into that, unfortunately, a lot in these times, don't we?
Yes, and that will definitely be part of our conversation when we get to ranking him at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So likewise, he acquired 736 additional acres in nearby Jackson County around 1811, and apparently owned 2 lots in Jefferson, the county seat of Jackson County. Woodlawn, meanwhile, grew from 300 acres in 1811 to 1,100 acres in 1813. As described by his biographer Mooney, quote, little is known of his agricultural production beyond the facts that he did raise cotton, corn, and hogs, and had rather extensive orchards. Crawford also experimented with different fertilizing and nitrogen-fixing agents, but his major innovative efforts were devoted to the introduction of new seeds, grasses, vines, and fruits. So now he's expanding into agriculture.
He would have had an okay time during the pandemic. He seems to be a guy who can occupy his time well, lots of hobbies, and he probably would have had a really good sourdough starter.
Yes, I could see him getting into that. And especially it does seem like he was focused on the home and, took up home projects just like so many of us did during the pandemic, because the family home is described as such. Quote, the house at Woodlawn is said to boast no artificial embellishments of taste. Rather, it portrayed the simplicity and unostentatious habits of its illustrious owner. But you have to imagine part of this was probably with this growing family, they needed all the money they could for what was going on the plantation, taking care of the kids. If he was sending them to be educated, that wasn't free education at that point. So it seems like, the house was plain, but probably pretty large.
It sounds that way. I agree.
Yeah. So despite being a family man, Crawford's dueling days were not over. So in 1806, his rival, John Clark, led an unsuccessful effort to impeach one of Crawford's allies who had been chosen for a judgeship over Clark's preferred candidate. By this point, Clark was convinced that Crawford was engaged in a conspiracy to take him down. And on December 2nd, 1806, he sent a challenge to Crawford, which the state representative accepted that same day.
He's back at it, even with the family. Dedication, I guess.
Here we go. Within 2 weeks, they ventured with their seconds into territory held by native people, and with the first shot, quote, Crawford's left wrist was badly damaged, and Crawford's second would not allow the contest to continue. So this one didn't turn out quite so well for him.
I guess not. So, Crawford's wrist was injured?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Wow, jeez. The fact that even if the bullet didn't hit in a, important structures like his radial artery, say, for instance, the way that they used to treat gunshot wounds back in the day, it was almost more harmful than leaving them alone. And so I don't know if you have those details, but the best thing they could have done here is clean it up and leave it alone and don't do 18th century medicine on it. Would have, or 19th century, I guess, at this point. That's more people died from infection and the meddling with these gunshot wounds than just leaving them alone, which would have been the better thing to do if you don't have a better thing to do.
You mean it's not like, with Garfield and just kind of poking the bullet wound with your finger and then inviting your friend to come over. Oh, why don't you poke the bullet wound?
That is a form of medicine that usually takes place in most movies as well. It is not entirely correct, and I won't tangent too far, but one of the bigger findings in surgery, especially around this time, was thanks to all the wars that were going on at all the times with gunshot wounds. A famous surgeon named John Hunter, who found a gaggle of, I believe it was French troops that were marooned on an island after they were all shot up, and they had no medical contact with anybody, no surgeons, etc., and they were all doing much better. And he thought, maybe we shouldn't go digging around every wound. And it was the start of something, the start of a better way of thinking.
Wow. So just don't do anything. Just clean it.
Sometimes you just stand there. Yeah. That's the best answer.
Good to know. Hopefully, if he did seek medical treatment, that's exactly what they did. Which he did, at least, we know that he survived. Clark would renew the challenge on July 22nd, 1807, but Crawford declined, asserting that the previous, quote, contest was brought to a final issue. So you get the sense that Crawford, now that he was the one shot, was like, maybe this dueling thing isn't such a good idea because this would be the end of his dueling days.
Easier when you're winning them all, I guess.
Exactly. Once you actually start being injured, like, maybe this isn't such a good idea.
Time to hang up the gloves, buddy.
Yeah.
Or the pistols.
As noted by his biographer Mooney, quote, he did not run from difficulty, but it does not appear that he intentionally offended others. After 1806, Crawford renounced physical violence as a means of settling differences between himself and others.
Very evolved. I like it.
Very evolved. It may take a gunshot wound to have it happen, but at least he learned his lesson.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Crawford's service in the Georgia State House of Representatives continued, and he served on numerous committees in the lead up to the 1806 election. He worked during this time, quote, to establish free schools and to authorize a lottery to raise $3,000 for books at the State College at Athens, as well as to improve the judicial system and the electoral process, and to provide funds for bridges and making the rivers more easily navigable.
Like infrastructure. Nice.
So he's getting involved in quite a bit.
Yeah.
Now, Crawford also led a successful effort to prohibit the, quote, importation of slaves into Georgia, both from other states and from abroad. And while it seems sometimes this is portrayed in history as, oh, well, they're trying to eventually get around to ending slavery, what we've come to find is that sometimes the motivation was, if you don't have any new enslaved people coming in, the ones that you currently have become more valuable. And because the enslaved individuals are going to produce more enslaved individuals, it becomes better for the enslaver to not have the competition.
I was waiting for the cynicism. It's well warranted in that case.
Yes. So we definitely cannot say that this was anything altruistic or trying to be anti-slavery. It most likely was, this is better for the slave owner.
The bottom line always.
Yes. So when the state legislature assembled at the new state capitol at Milledgeville in November 1807, as a reflection of his growing political clout in the state, the 35-year-old Crawford was chosen as the late Abraham Baldwin's successor in the U.S. Senate. So he is headed to Washington. Crawford came into the Senate on December 9th, 1807, at a time that officials in Washington were debating how to respond to growing tensions between the U.S. and its two key trading partners, Great Britain and France. Luckily for Crawford and everybody else, the Jefferson administration had a solution: the Embargo Act. Let's just stop trading with everybody.
It's an option. It is an option.
It is an option. Now, given that Crawford had had no time to study the Embargo Act, which came up for a vote 9 days after he assumed his seat, he ultimately voted against it, a vote that would be used against him as he, quote, was accused of Federalist leanings. However, as noted by Mooney, quote, it probably would have been more appropriate for Crawford to abstain, but this was a tactic he rarely adopted. He was inclined to vote against measures he had not studied. So he's like, I'm not going to give up my vote. I'm going to vote against it if I don't know what it is.
I will say that it's not a totally unreasonable option, I guess. Certainly if you don't know what the ramifications are of the legislation put forward, I guess it's better than going along with it because, without knowing what you're voting for. Partial credit.
Exactly. So so-and-so said it was good, right? Everything's fine, right? Yeah. So definitely erring on the side of caution. So Crawford would come around, and by the end of 1808, quote, was a staunch defender of the embargo, which he felt his constituents accepted, quote, as the only alternative to war, which, again, that was the motivation from Jefferson and Madison supporting the embargo, economic coercion versus military.
It's still used today.
Still used today.
Tried and true.
So, the embargo ultimately was unsuccessful. We will get around to war. It's coming. But again, for Mooney, quote, as a freshman senator, he, Crawford, spoke infrequently. Generally, during the 1807-1808 session, Crawford seemed to be acquainting himself with some of the problems and fulfilling a number of committee assignments credibly. So he's taking I'm just going to kind of sit back and watch, listen. I'm going to get to learn what's going on here.
Again, reasonable.
Yeah, again, reasonable. He's taking a kind of, let's take some time approach.
Let's figure out. He got his syllabus. He's got his orientation day going on. He's got to get his work badge. You're easing into the process. This is Congress.
Exactly. Now, Crawford was courted by Representative John Randolph of Roanoke and some of the members of the Georgia congressional delegation about supporting former U.S. Minister to Britain James Monroe's candidacy for the presidency over Jefferson's preferred successor, Secretary of State James Madison. So the Jameses ended up kind of competing with one another time and time again, and this was one of those points. Now, while Crawford spoke favorably of Monroe around this time, it doesn't seem like he was a strong supporter of his challenge, while other more vocal Monroe supporters would find themselves shut out and their political careers ended when Madison inevitably came to office. So again, kind of taking that wait and see. Okay, he seems like a good guy, but I'm not willing to place a bet on him just yet.
Again, caution's okay in many of these cases.
Yeah. And at this time, Crawford, in 1808, he was really more focused on something that he knew, Georgia politics. And he worked with the successful gubernatorial candidate, David B. Mitchell, in his campaign, and was pleased to see his friend from his days at the Richmond Academy, Charles Tate, elected to serve alongside him in the U.S. Senate. So Crawford wouldn't become prominent in Washington circles until February 1811, when he came out in defense of the renewal of the charter of the First Bank of the United States. And again, this is a point that we've come to numerous times in the Seat at the Table series, as well as the Madison presidency narrative. The bank's charter, it was a 20-year charter. It was coming up for renewal. And at this point, even folks who had argued against it when it was originally put through were like, no, we really do need this. It isn't as bad as we thought.
He gave it time to cook, as they say.
Exactly. And so Crawford, in coordination with Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin, offered up the bill to renew the charter for 20 years on February 5th, 1811. This would pit him against Senator Henry Clay, Democratic-Republican from Kentucky, who was an opponent of the renewal.
I've heard of that guy.
Yeah, he's a, one of those minor characters in American history, maybe getting an episode of his own in this series. We'll have to wait and see. Now, as noted by his biographer Mooney, quote, as chief spokesman for the renewal of the bank charter, Crawford ran counter to the majority of the Republican Party and to public opinion in general, and his use of the doctrine of implied powers to prove the constitutionality of the bank places him outside the fold of old republicanism. So rather than seeing this as a debate over the constitutionality of the national bank, quote, in denouncing the larger states that sought destruction of the bank, Crawford charged their actions were motivated by the desire to dominate and by avarice. They hoped to compel the United States to use their banks as places of deposit and thus increase their dividends. So he's taking this he's looking at it and saying, I know what you're up to. You're just wanting the money for yourself.
That's almost always a reasonable starting thought. It's not always the case, but it's always let's examine that as a motivation first.
Exactly. So he's really saying, I think there's something more going on here. And ultimately, Crawford would be proven right when, fast forward to Jackson's presidency, the bank war, the Bank of the United States is killed. That's what happens. The federal deposits have to go somewhere, so they choose these banks, these state banks, to put them into. So Ultimately, despite Crawford's arguments, the Senate vote came to a tie, and thus it was Vice President George Clinton who cast...
Parliament Funkadelic?
Yeah. No, he's the less funky George Clinton.
Okay. I got super excited about that.
Which, for our listeners, if you haven't listened to our two-part George Clinton episode of the vice presidencies of the United States, there is much to talk about with this less funky George Clinton. But George Clinton was the one who cast the vote to decide the bank's fate, and he voted against renewal. As noted by Mooney, quote, "The odds against Crawford's winning the fight for the bank were too great, but his efforts won the admiration of many and raised him to preeminence in the Senate. It displayed his independence of spirit and action, his frankness and fearlessness, his ability of clear and logical exposition, and his composure in the heated debate. Further, he had ridiculed party rigidity, declared war on special interest and tyranny, and appealed for action in the name of the public welfare." So he waited a bit for his chance, and when it came, he took it.
That makes sense. I mean, all that practice he had at home by having all the logical discussions with his family, including his children, and then no longer shooting his rivals in duels. I think it seems to have left him with a really level head. It's good for public office.
Yeah. He's come a long way. And so now he's starting to make his name in Washington. It also earned Crawford the respect of Secretary Gallatin, and thus was kind of an end to the Madison administration. This did not mean, however, that he was a lockstep yes man for the administration, and indeed is on record as being, quote, "on several occasions sharply critical of and even opposed to the administration." However, it doesn't seem like that was really like that turned Madison or administration officials against him. And again, Max, you brought up that point of, the family discussions. More than likely, he approached it from a place of, "I respectfully disagree. Here's why."
Yeah.
And they respected him for it.
When did we stop doing that in politics? Did you come across that yet in all of the in all of your research?
Probably about this point.
Okay.
So when the Senate reconvened in the fall of 1811, Crawford was reappointed to committees he had previously worked on, but illness would keep him from attending Senate business starting on December 20th, 1811, until he recovered enough to resume his seat on January 28th, 1812, and he wouldn't be back to full speed for another month. So he has kind of this bout of illness, seems like it lasts a little bit, but he does at least recover.
He had the sickness not otherwise specified.
Exactly. Just kind of the malaise.
Malaise that's one of my favorite words. You know what it means, but it doesn't describe anything specific.
Exactly. And so this non-specific illness took him out for a little bit, but he finally came back. And as his illness subsided, Crawford was named to a committee, quote, "to consider the report of the Secretary of the Navy." Though Crawford had felt that in the absence of the embargo, war should be the next step, as war had not come, and he felt that the, quote, "warlike proposals that had been coming through Congress were totally inadequate to meet the situation." He had, to that point, been critical of bills and proposals advocating for preparedness. However, this new report from the Secretary of the Navy, when one of his committee colleagues put forward a bill, quote, "authorizing construction of several new frigates," Crawford delivered a speech on March 2nd in opposition. So he's trying to feel things out. He's like, we need war, but I'm not really thinking that the plans that have been put forward thus far are really what we need. Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's not enough.
He was more of a, we need more galleons kind of guy. He's like the frigate.
Yes.
I know we don't need frigates. We need galleons. Come on.
And this would actually prove to be, quote, his last major speech in the Senate. Because as a reflection of his growing prominence, when the Senate had to adjourn on March 23rd due to the illness of Vice President Clinton, the following day, Crawford was elected as President pro tempore of the Senate to preside over the body in Clinton's absence to allow them to continue their business. And so this is interesting. It's actually an office that we still have to this day, the President pro tem. So the Senate has to have a presiding officer in order to carry out official business. First up is the vice president, who is the president of the Senate. If the vice president is unavailable, then the president pro tem of the Senate is kind of the backup for that.
Ah, I see. You can't have a good meeting without the roles identified. Somebody has to have a gavel.
Exactly.
You've got to have procedure. Got to say the right words. And you have to have these things.
So they are saying, we are handing the gavel to you. Now, as we heard about in Clinton's episode, unfortunately, this was an illness from which he would not recover. And with Clinton's death on April 20th, a president pro tempore would be needed for the next congressional session as well, until a new VP was elected and inaugurated in 1813. So this was an election year. So they knew a new vice president was coming. And this was the beginning of the precedent that lasted well into the 20th century of, when something happens to the vice president, we don't choose another one. We just let the president pro tem do the job.
Gotcha.
So they talked about it, and Crawford was reelected to the post in the next session, and he presided over the body through the end of the 12th Congress. And for those who may have missed it, there is actually a special episode of the Vice Presidency series that kind of dives into what the president pro tem is, what the office was at that point, what it's become. So be sure to check that out. But for Crawford's tenure of nearly a year in that role, as noted by Mooney, quote, he seems not to have used his position to make partisan appointments or confer personal favors, but the use of his influence as presiding officer, and perhaps now as leader of the administration forces, may be inferred from the voting on a few occasions. So he knew kind of the soft diplomacy behind the scenes.
No personal favors either. That seems kind of refreshing.
Yes. Again, this may have been the last time that happened. But also, as noted by Mooney, quote, Crawford, removed from active participation by virtue of his position as presiding officer, voted consistently with the war party. And yes, by this point, war had been declared against Great Britain, and the War of 1812 was on. So Crawford had been in the 19-13 majority in the Senate, who voted for the declaration of war in June 1812. So he is in the war camp.
He's probably going to want those frigates now, to be honest.
Maybe we'll go ahead and rethink that one. Pull that plan back out. Now, Crawford had had his eye on the Spanish-held territory in Florida for some time, and with the coming of the war and the fact that the independent portion of Spain was an ally of Great Britain, he advocated for American forces seizing the remainder of Florida as part of the concurrent Creek War happening in the southwestern portion of the U.S. So he was like, maybe we can just take Florida, They're not using it.
I mean, I guess if you're already at war in the area, it's sort of an efficient use of troops, but maybe he just really wanted to build a lot of condos.
Yeah, he could. He was wanting to get into the condo business. Now, unfortunately, he could not secure congressional approval for the taking of East Florida. Only West Florida, which was the portion of the Gulf Coast from the west to modern-day southern Alabama. So, kind of that stretch, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama.
Seems like a weird way to divide that. Like, why not just leave the southern part of Florida and then take the northern part? It just seems like a weird line to divide it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the history of the Floridas is quite interesting. I've been diving more into that, which won't go down that rabbit hole, but it's really interesting. And I really haven't been able to find why they made the cutoff where they did. It doesn't make sense.
The first Florida man might have had something to do with it.
I'm going to draw this line right here. Hold my beer. So Crawford would become a vocal critic of the Madison administration's prosecution of the war, and in particular, the lack of vigorous and knowledgeable leadership provided by Secretary of War William Eustis and Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton, both of whom have been covered in this series, and we saw the problems that they had. Now, when Secretary of State Monroe reached out to Crawford in early December 1812 for a meeting and shared with him his desire of replacing the outgoing Eustis at the War Department, Crawford shared with him his concern that Monroe's confirmation would not be guaranteed. Instead, Crawford whether asked by President Madison or not. It's not sure if the president actually asked for his opinion or he just gave his opinion. But Crawford offered up his thoughts about the top contenders for the War Department. And on his list, he had Monroe, General John Armstrong, General Henry Dearborn, New York Governor Daniel Tompkins, and General William Henry Harrison. Now, he really couldn't speak to the latter three, but asserted that he felt Armstrong, quote, did not possess the confidence of the nation and had already given his thoughts on Monroe. Crawford would find himself approached about taking up the position, but he declined in early January 1813, which was probably a good call. You don't want to be Secretary of War when the War Department's kind of a mess.
I was going to say, did he have a lot of experience militarily?
I mean, he's got all those military books on the shelves behind him, so yeah.
Okay, I mean, it's not zero. It's not zero experience. It might not be the most practical experience, but I agree. Maybe a bad move to jump into that role at this time.
Maybe let's let someone else handle that one. Now, there's apparently a theory that the administration insiders wanted Monroe to move to the War Department, Gallatin to the State Department, and Crawford to take up the role of Secretary of the Treasury. But in terms of primary resources, there's not really anything to validate this theory. So ultimately, Monroe would remain at State, John Armstrong would be brought in as head of the War Department, and Gallatin would stay at Treasury for the time being. So even though it sounds like, Crawford had some concerns about Armstrong, they finally settled on him, and you can find out more about that in his episode of this series. But again, rather than putting him at odds with the administration, Crawford's criticism would result in him being brought more into the fold, which is kind of a mature approach. You want somebody poking holes in your plans. You want somebody who can give that critical eye, who can be the devil's advocate. You want that point of view at the table. And as noted by Mooney, quote, a closer personal relationship was developing between Crawford and Madison. Now, Crawford's efforts for the U.S. in the War of 1812 would shift from a legislative to a diplomatic role, as he would be chosen as the successor to the unfortunate U.S. Minister to France, Joel Barlow, who died in the midst of the Grande Armée's frenzied retreat from Russia. And that we covered that on the narrative series, but Barlow did not have a good time.
Doesn't sound like it ended in a good time.
No. But on March 23rd, 1813, Crawford resigned his seat in the Senate, and on May 28th, he was approved by the Senate and received his commission. After resigning his seat, Crawford briefly returned home to Woodlawn to make preparations there, then went back to Washington, and then finally, with his legation secretary Henry Jackson, he traveled to New York City in June to set out across the Atlantic. Doesn't sound like it was a fun voyage because he apparently suffered from sickness much of the journey and was likely quite relieved when the ship arrived in western France on July 11th, nearly a month after setting off.
I don't know if it was seasickness, but I always feel, I've been on a cruise once, and I don't get seasickness, but I definitely feel for people who do, because especially as Crawford's setting off to go across the Atlantic, not a 2-day trip there at this time.
No.
And you're just going to be miserable for so much of the time. And folks stuck on cruise ships, especially if it's seasickness or you've got a fun norovirus outbreak or that sort of thing, it's just, that medically speaking sucks because you're just going to be miserable for so long.
Yeah, and there's really nothing you can do until you get there. And so Crawford, when he finally got there, he's like, I'm going to need a few days to recover. So kind of took a few days before he and Jackson proceeded to Paris, where they arrived on July 24th for him to take up his post. As we've seen in the narrative series and with other cabinet members like Monroe and Armstrong, who we've covered previously, this position, the chief U.S. diplomat in Paris, is not an easy one. The French government had proven less than amenable as a diplomatic partner, and as noted by Mooney, quote, the dismal performance of the American military establishment prior to Crawford's arrival in France scarcely permitted him to negotiate from a position of strength. His assignment was indeed a difficult one. So they're like, hey, y'all are losing this war anyway. You don't have anything to offer. Why should we talk to you?
It's a difficult place to negotiate from, I would agree.
Yeah.
You want to have a few cards in your hand.
Yeah, a couple at least. But the U.S. could ill afford a diplomatic rupture with France while still at war with Britain. and it could only be hoped that the agreement that Crawford's predecessor had negotiated with the French government was one that was favorable to American interests. Indeed, Secretary of State Monroe, in his instructions to the new minister, gave him latitude to judge whether to, quote, sign and forward the treaty, or if he did not approve of the terms of the treaty, he should notify the French government and try to obtain alterations. So, his predecessor Barlow had made some progress, but they didn't really know the details. He passed away before he could share that. So
that's rough.
Once you get on the ground, go ahead and sort through, see what you can find out.
I like to imagine this as that scenario where there's like two people on either end of the table and you're like pushing the little piece of paper across, looking at it, folding it, writing your countermeasures. Except that in this case, it sounds like the French government had a piece of paper. They're like, this is totally what we agreed to, by the way, here you go, and push it. It would be hard to know, right? It'd be hard to know.
Exactly.
Where did those things leave off? Because he probably didn't bring his laptop with him. He didn't have those records. And a little trickier this time.
Exactly. And President Madison also insisted that no agreement could be entered into that did not provide for at least some restitution for attacks on American commerce by the French, or, quote, placing commercial relations with France on a just and stable foundation. So in the lead up to the War of 1812, it was kind of neck and neck, which nation were we going to go to war with, because both were impacting American commerce. And even after war was declared, France still continued. And so he's like, we've got to do something about that before we can move on anything else. Now, one thing to note here, Crawford was the chief diplomatic officer in Western Europe at the time. So at this point, there was no minister to London. There was no minister to Madrid. There was just Crawford.
He's the guy.
He's the guy.
He's the Europe guy.
So he, quote, was given superintendence of all consuls of the United States in France, her European dependencies, and Italy, and was instructed to adopt appropriate measures to keep them in strict performance of their duties. But he found himself at odds with some of the people under his charge who had taken charge of diplomatic relations in Europe in the interregnum between Barlow and Crawford. So they were kind of getting out of their lane because there was nobody there.
There's no parent in the house. They were unsupervised, and they started going feral.
Yes, including David Bailey Warren, who was the U.S. consul at Paris. He was, quote, severely reprimanded for publicly disputing and quarreling over the handling of prize vessels and commissions on the sale of such vessels. As there was no improvement in his conduct, so Crawford gave him a warning. He was like, you can't do that anymore. Crawford dismissed him from his post on May 31st, 1814. But Warden refused to recognize his dismissal without, quote, a legalized copy of Monroe's communication authorizing the action. He's like, no, there's somebody higher than you, and until they say something, I'm just going to stay right here.
Well, and I think we all know that Warden, while Crawford was dismissing him, had his fingers crossed behind his back, and you can't dismiss somebody if that is the case.
Yes. I mean, it's the rules, right?
Rules are rules.
So ultimately, Warden was forced to leave office without this demand being met. Quote, but he refused to turn over many embassy papers until informed that the settlement of his account depended on their delivery. So he was like, well, fine, I'll leave, but I'm going to take all of these papers with me. And then they were like, well, do you want to get your final paycheck? Maybe you should give those back.
Interesting extortion. I like that. I like the you can't have the government property back until I get my paycheck.
Exactly.
It's a bold move.
And this would be, one of the frustrating things that Crawford was having to deal with. But he also had another major roadblock to overcome in assuming his duties. Technically, a diplomatic minister was not to negotiate with a foreign government until they had been officially recognized by that government. And in Imperial France, that meant an audience with the Emperor Napoleon to receive Crawford's credentials. Napoleon, however, was in Dresden at the time. So he's like, I'm not going to Dresden. I'll wait for him to get back here. The other guy followed Napoleon across Europe, and we see how that turned out.
It's a long march. Long march.
Yeah. So as he waited in this place of limbo, it gave Crawford time to start becoming acquainted with the documents that had been left by his predecessor. He didn't find a copy of the agreement that Barlow had reached in the embassy's files, but was finally able to secure a purported copy from the French Office of Exterior Relations. If it was accurate, and again, when you're getting it from the other side of the diplomatic table, you have reason to question, is this really the deal that you worked out? It seems rather favorable to you.
It's totally the details we talked about before you got here, I swear.
Yeah, that's totally. No. We didn't write in a few extra zeros in there. No. But as noted by Mooney, Crawford, quote, understood how Barlow could be considered a tool of the French government. This document gave sanction to Napoleon's continental system of strongly regulated trade with Europe and placed arbitrary power in the hands of French officials. So he's like, if this is true, this guy was completely in over his head. He gave the French whatever they wanted.
He's bad at negotiating.
Yes. So naturally, Crawford would not give his approval to this treaty and sent word as such to the government on August 15th, 1813. Now, while waiting to be officially received by the French government, Crawford engaged in a study of the French language, which is rather helpful when you're negotiating with French people.
He just started studying it now?
Yes.
Okay. Better late than never, but
better late than never. He also moved the U.S. ministry to the Hôtel Le Grand Batelier and dined with the widowed Mrs. Barlow and her family. Crawford was rather critical of his first exposure to French culture and society, expressing a displeasure at the prominence of nude sculptures and the, shall we say, open marriage arrangements that were rather prevalent in Parisian society.
That's pretty funny to me, actually. I enjoy the culture shock of.
Oh yeah.
Some of that seems very modern, and some of it is like, artistic nudes are one thing, and it's not for Crawford though. He's not having that.
No, Crawford is over there clutching his pearls. Oh my word. But finally, Crawford grew fed up with waiting for Napoleon to return to be officially recognized and wrote out the American position on negotiations, which he sent to the French foreign minister on September 11th, 1813. As many of his predecessors had, Crawford would find his talks with the French government to be a long, drawn-out back and forth. However, he kept at the efforts, as well as worked to get information from U.S. Minister to Russia, John Quincy Adams, about the progress of mediation efforts that had been initiated by the Russian Tsar to end the War of 1812, as he knew that would impact his negotiations with the French. As noted by Mooney, quote, throughout his ministry, Crawford wrote long, informative, and quite accurate letters to Monroe on the military and political situation in France and the rest of Europe. So he's like, if I'm not making any progress with diplomacy, at least I can provide you with tons of information about what's going on here.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. But on November 14th, 1813, with Emperor Napoleon's return to Paris, William Crawford was finally received as the official U.S. minister to France. It was around this time that the negotiating partner on the other side of the table changed as the emperor named Armand Augustin Louis de Caulaincourt, the Duc de Vescens, as his new foreign minister.
It's a lot of names and titles.
Yes.
No wonder the conversations were so long and drawn out. You got to say that every time he sits down?
You're just sitting there waiting. Okay, no, they're still on his name.
What would be his nickname? I mean, there's 6 names. I mean, you just call him Armand? Army? Call him
Army. So, as was the French style, 4 days after Crawford wrote to the new minister on November 23rd, they were engaged in a conference where our friend Army insisted that the emperor wished to settle all points of contention with the United States. But the foreign minister left the conference saying that he had to get Napoleon's thoughts on the discussions before he could proceed. And there, the matter stood for months. He was basically like, we really do want to settle this. Let me just go and check with the manager.
Yeah.
And then you hear the car pull off in a screech.
Yeah.
And don't hear anything back.
I've been on those dates. It's embarrassing when you're sitting at the table by yourself for so long until you figure out what happened.
You're like, they're not coming back, are they?
They sure aren't.
Now, to be fair to the French, as Allied troops were amassing with Paris as their ultimate goal, it's kind of understandable that negotiations with the Americans were not really at the top of their priority list. Crawford reported back to his government about the developments, expressing his belief in mid-February that the Allied forces were set to reinstall the Bourbon monarchy. And indeed, a provisional government was established, and at the end of March, Louis XVIII was back in France. So this new provisional government started to make more favorable overtures to the U.S. Minister to France about settling claims of, quote, the illegal confiscations which had been committed on American commerce, which you can understand. This is a new government. They're trying to get established. They need as many friends as they can get. And, maybe we can just settle things with these pesky Americans.
Look, in other terms, they're rebranding.
Exactly.
They're rebuilding those relationships.
Exactly. So Crawford used this change of government as an opportunity in the spring of 1814 to request, quote, permission to return home as soon as he had made a fair experiment with the restored Bourbon government. Secretary Monroe requested that Crawford remain a bit longer in order to allow the administration time to determine a suitable replacement for him, which, considering that this was in the summer of 1814 and the British were starting to make moves threatening Washington, D.C. around this time, again, it's understandable why the president and the cabinet may not have had finding Crawford's replacement as a top priority.
Be honest. When's the last time you had a homemade meal? We get it. Between meetings, workout classes, and the kids' after-school sports, who's got time to cook? That's where HelloFresh comes in. No matter how busy you get, HelloFresh has everything you need to get an easy, home-cooked meal on the table. With flavor-packed recipes like Parmesan herb-crusted salmon, you'll be filling your kitchen with the cozy aromas of a homemade meal in no time. So go ahead, try HelloFresh. It's homemade, made easy. Learn more at HelloFresh.com.
Crawford tried to help the process along by suggesting U.S. Peace Commissioner Henry Clay as his replacement, but Clay, when told of this idea, shared with his fellow diplomat that he planned to return to his prior post as Speaker of the House of Representatives once the negotiations with the British were concluded. Clay was like, no, I've seen this one play out. I'm going to go back to being Speaker. Thus, armed with the letter of credence that Monroe provided, Crawford was officially presented to the new government on August 16th. Now, the foreign minister in this new government was a man who had previously served in the Directory government and had served under Napoleon in this same role. This is our old friend, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgaud.
Only 5 names.
Only 5 names.
Less important than Army.
And again, can't go down the rabbit hole, but Talleyrand is the ultimate survivor of the French Revolution. He basically found his way in pretty much any situation to end up coming back on top and serving as French foreign minister in numerous different types of government.
He's like the last Highlander. He is the one who outsurvived them all.
Exactly. And so Talleyrand was the survivor. He was a seasoned practitioner of the French art of diplomacy at the time, where promises were insinuated, but the actual follow-up was unceasingly deferred with one excuse after another. No, we'll get back to you. I promise. No, just wait for us to get back to you. I promise. It's really going to be good. You're going to love the answer that we give you. Now, again, to be fair to Talleyrand, his focus was more on the Congress of Vienna, which had been called to decide the path forward for Europe in the post-Napoleonic era. So thinking about the future of Europe versus American complaints. I think those complaints can wait.
Well, the good thing is they focused well enough on that after this period of time, Europe never had any more conflict.
Nope, it was all fine after this. Meanwhile, American commerce continued to be harassed by French officials, just as it had under the Napoleonic government, and just as before, Crawford's complaints on behalf of American merchants fell on deaf ears, despite the fact that Madison had issued a proclamation that the U.S. would respect the rights of neutral trading, even if it was trading with Britain, with whom it was at war. So they're saying we will do whatever it takes to show that we're respecting neutral trade, if you will. And they're like, that's cute. So, in particular, the seizure of an American ship, the Decatur, led Crawford to question, quote, whether the United States could keep a minister at the French court unless the matter was settled. So he's starting to say, if you're not going to do anything about this, then maybe we just need to get out of here. Maybe we don't need somebody here because you're not talking to us anyway.
Is that curious? Is that how much of a threat is that in this time politically? So not having a person there, what cards, what clout does that give the U.S. at this time?
So basically, and there are a few stages before relations are completely broken off and before war is declared. And the first is saying that the minister, the head diplomat, is going to leave. They'll leave a chargé d'affaires, which is basically like the second person on the rung in the embassy. But it also reflects that you don't take the government seriously enough to send a full minister.
Gotcha. So would it be the equivalent of, you're at an Applebee's and you have disagreement with another patron and you're like, I am going to remove myself from this booth and I will possibly meet you in the parking lot where you might have a scrap. You're just basically saying this might go further by withdrawing your person. Okay, I get you. Always comes down to a fight.
The stages of escalation in terms of ultimately leading to war. So this is kind of that first warning. Meanwhile, Crawford had maintained a regular correspondence with the Peace Commission, as Monroe had suggested, and as noted by Mooney, quote, Crawford played an active role and one of substantial importance in the work towards establishing a peaceful resolution of the conflict with Britain. His position as the chief American diplomat in Western Europe afforded him intelligence about the positions and current status of the Allied powers that he could then feed to the peace commissioners that could then inform their negotiations with the British. So he's trying to give them as much information as possible to know just how hard to push or when to say, we'll give a little bit. Crawford also gave them political clout and support to go beyond the letter of their instructions when needed to ensure a swift resolution to their work rather than waiting months on end for confirmation from the administration in Washington to traverse the Atlantic. So he's telling them, do what you need to do. I got you. Now, one item of note with Crawford's tenure as U.S. Minister to France that was particularly interesting is this quote from Mooney. Quote, at the end of the war with England, Crawford devoted some attention to the appointment of consuls in Europe, detailing for Monroe those who then held post and were appointed by the president, and noting that a number of those listed in the almanac for 1814, which Monroe had sent to him, were either dead or had returned to the United States some years before. He's like, you may want to update your records.
Yeah, that those links are broken to your website, and you haven't changed them in many years. Always update the records when people are no longer showing up to work.
And hopefully you haven't been sending their paychecks because who knows who's actually getting them.
It's an HR mess.
Now, as he prepared to end his service, Crawford learned of the success of the negotiations at Ghent and likely looked forward to returning home to a United States at peace. However, his service would not end without another surprise twist, because at the end of February 1815, the former emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, escaped from the island of Elba and returned to France. Gathering more forces the closer he got to Paris, it was clear that Napoleon was making a bid to return to power. Thus, on March 19th, King Louis XVIII and his family fled from the Tuileries, and the next day, Napoleon reoccupied the palace and declared himself emperor once more.
Oh, that rapscallion.
So this is now the second change of government in France that he's witnessed. While the other members of the diplomatic corps in Paris had asked for their passports and fled the French capital, Crawford remained, and, as noted by Mooney, quote, was the only remaining minister who did not represent a nation at war with France at the time of the abdication of Napoleon.
I think he was just kind of getting used to all the naked statues and the way of life over there at this point.
He's like, I'm just going to stay here and look at these statues some more. I'm studying them. I'm preparing.
He's reading the articles.
Yes, I'm reading the articles on them. I'm preparing my arguments against them, but I've got to do some more detailed study. Now, our old friend Army came back into office as foreign minister in the restored imperial government, And soon Crawford was in touch with him to resume discussions on American claims. So he's back and they're like, okay, where did we leave off before? Oh, yes, I was putting you off. I was trying to pretend to ignore you. So let's just pick up there. And so that didn't go anywhere. Instead, Crawford prepared for his departure from France. On April 24th, there was a farewell dinner thrown in his honor. And on the 26th, he departed for England, leaving Henry Jackson as the chargé in Paris. Traveling with him was James A. Bayard from the American delegation that negotiated the Treaty of Ghent. Crawford and Bayard planned to wait for the other peace commissioners who were traveling back to the U.S., but as Bayard was quite ill and wished to return home before he passed away, the two set sail aboard the Neptune on June 18th, arriving in Wilmington, Delaware on August 1st, where Bayard died on the 7th. So kind of a sad end to his diplomatic career, escorting somebody home to die.
Yeah, it is a bummer way to end it, but yeah, it seems like he had a reasonably fruitful diplomatic career at a tough time. So, there's some give and take there. It's going to get him some points.
Yeah, and Mooney sums up Crawford's tenure as U.S. Minister to France as follows, quote, "There is no doubt that Crawford did not accomplish the major purpose of his mission, but the later accusation of his political foes that his appointment was strictly political and that failure resulted from Crawford's deficiencies does not seem justified. So there was really only so much he could do. He tried to do as much as he could."
Yeah, that's not always possible to get everything you want in a negotiation.
Yes. And indeed, as we've seen in this series, as well as the narrative series, several capable diplomats had tried and failed to achieve results from the French government. And, quote, "These problems did not yield a solution for almost 20 years. So it wasn't just Crawford. It wasn't just that he had done a bad job.
Sure.
But, you have to wonder kind of how he felt about this. His mission really wasn't that successful. But, hey, America was out of war now. He was coming back to a peacetime government. And though Crawford had been hoping to return to civilian life, he learned while waiting to sail from Plymouth, England, that he had been nominated and confirmed as the 9th U.S. Secretary of War.
Hey, there you go.
So he at least knows that he's going home to a new position. He's got a post in the government.
It's nice to know you're returning home with a new job, and it probably, an upgrade. Got a promotion. Can't be mad about that.
Yes, absolutely. And so that seems like a good place to end part one of Crawford's story. He is about to join the cabinet, and believe you me, there is a lot to talk about in his cabinet tenure because, spoiler alert, he's going to last a while.
Well, that's a good, long, healthy career. It's not such a bad thing, is it?
We shall see. But before we close out this episode, Max, first impressions of Crawford.
So, I would say that, starting with the diplomacy, he is thrown into a seemingly impossible situation. He is, he's tasked with making these very difficult negotiations between two initially warring countries, and then one of them, then no longer warring, and one of which has really no clear incentive to do business with him. That country then switches its own government multiple times under bloody circumstances. And so he doesn't get a perfect result, but I don't know that he ever was going to. And probably, truthfully, pulled maybe one of the best results he could get out of that. So I'm going to give a qualified decent amount of points for that.
Absolutely.
What were some of the other highlights there? There was, that was the most recent in my mind.
Yeah. So, his tenure in the Senate, starting to, rise to national prominence, getting close with the Madison administration, becoming president pro tempore, which he didn't do much, but it's a nice little,
Well, I would say you got to give some points for establishing himself as somebody who was going to proceed with a rationale that was well argued, and would not immediately follow the party line, so to speak, that would be willing to withstand being a yes man for reasons that he was able to state. So I think that speaks to integrity, and something that we were joking is probably we just don't see a lot of that anymore, at least for perhaps the right reasons, etc. So I think that gives him a plus in my book. I'm gonna give some negatives for the owning of slaves, and some of the earlier decisions he made on trying to preserve the business practices. That's a big negative, and I know it was a different time, but still, it's a huge negative in my book. But you can't argue with the fact that he seemed to have a gradually increasing stature within the government. And as we kind of talked about a bit, that he was not a guy who did a lot of, sounds like, back dealing and, backroom deals and giving out favors. It sounds like, my impression is he seemed to be a politician trying to do things for the right reasons. And I hate that sounds novel, in the modern day, but this was a newer country at the time, and perhaps there was a little bit more of that. You know more than I in that case, but I'm excited to get into more illness too. Yeah, there's illness coming. There's going to be all kinds of illness coming. So, yeah, I think I give him. Let's see, we'll go on the old grade scale. He gets. He's going to get a B from me, not a B minus, not a B plus. Give him B, given the circumstances.
Yeah. And we'll see if he holds to that B, if he is able to bring his grade up a notch, if he starts to fall in part 2 of this episode. We'll see what happens when he joins the cabinet, and we'll see. I think there's going to be quite a bit to discuss once we get into his cabinet tenure. But until then, thank you so much, Max, for joining me for this episode. For our audience, thank you for joining us. Be sure to check out the Poor Historians podcast. I will be sharing information on my social media around the release of this episode. I'll also have a link on the website, which is presidenciespodcast.com. So be sure to check it out, and then come back for part 2 of William H. Crawford. Max, thank you so much.
Hey, fun to be here. Learned a lot.
And for our audience, until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
The Battle of Waterloo was one of the most famous turning points in world history. But what happened next? My name's David Montgomery, and I'm the host of The Siècle, a history podcast that tackles exactly that. Join me as I cover France's overlooked century in between Napoleon and World War I. The Siècle, spelled S-I-E-C-L-E, is part of the Evergreen Podcast Network and can be found wherever you get podcasts.